Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Midwestern Marks live stream. I am here with Carlos and Noah. We wanted to be with you yesterday, but we were unable to due to a little bit of an emergency situation there. But we are here. We've got some great topics for you today. Hopefully, we'll get through a handful of them, but um, however many we get through in the next hour or so is fine. So glad that you're all with us. One of the main things we're going to be tackling today is the blockade on Cuba and how that affects their healthcare system. Carlos recently wrote and had published a really fantastic and in-depth article analyzing that. So he'll discuss that a little bit. Noah and I will add some of our thoughts. And yeah, we'll move on from there. So without further ado, I'll play the intro and then we can get started. All right, welcome everybody. Got a whole bunch of hello comrades in the chat. One comrade says he just got out of therapy. Sam Dixon says now it's time for your second therapy session. You bet. Glad we could bring that to you. Sure, some of you are watching us on company time while you're at work, so solidarity with you. Yeah, how you guys doing today?
Good. I'm doing good. Hanging in there. I've had a long couple weeks at work. I'm very excited to hear all about this article that Carlos has written. I've been meaning to read it for a while. I just haven't gotten around to it with work. So very, very excited. Speaking of work, if the guys on Kevin's crew are listening, what's up, guys?
What's up, Kevin's crew?
I've been busy for you guys know I'm in the middle of a moving process, and on top of that I've had to juggle a few other things, the book, the release, managing the website stuff, editing articles, teaching, grading, a whole host of things. So if I don't go nuts by the end of this week, I guess that's a good sign.
Go nuts.
It's you have to combine a little bit of insight with insanity for it to actually be insight. But I had been asked to do this article on the effects of the US blockade on Cuban medicine, I think at the end of last year, by our comrades over at Science for the People magazine, which is a quite special project of scientists that are all Marxists. And there's it's a fairly old magazine, if I'm correct. It dates back to the 60s, and it's always been able to really connect the sort of pursuit of science with the pursuit of socialism. And back in the day, it would travel to socialist countries, to Cuba, to China, and it's always done great work. And I think it stopped running as a magazine when the Soviet Union collapsed, and they got it back up a few years ago. So I had published an article for them earlier last year on serotonin and the recent studies which had debunked the theory of serotonin as a way to explain depression. And then they asked me to write an article on the influence of the blockade on Cuban medicine. So I wrote that, got published, I believe, 2 weeks ago. And I'm going to talk about it here a little bit more generally than I would have probably preferred, but that's only because we were going to be planning on doing a video essay of sorts. It's something we haven't really tried in the past, but we want to give it a go with this article just because it's got the sort of shelf life that I think is going to maintain its relevance for quite some time, and simply because it dives into a lot of details about the particularities of how the blockade prevents Cuba from getting certain specific equipments, resources, and medicines, and the companies that have been contacted, the rejections, the companies that have ignored requests, and that whole uh, that whole process that depicts really at the most concrete level how it is that the US blockade affects Cuba in the realm of its medical practices and healthcare, and how it affects the lives of hundreds of thousands of Cubans, and as I'll talk about later on, also the lives of anywhere from 10 to 100,000 Americans. How that process looks at the very concrete level, because that's a question that we're constantly getting, like how do these sanctions function, like what concretely does it look like, what are they prevented from getting, why is it that socialists and communists pay so much attention on the effects that these sanction regimes have on socialist countries. So I think that the the whole plethora of details that I provide for how that works just with medicine is something that's going to help people sort of see at the ground level how it is that sanctions affect countries. But one of the things that I wanted to start off by saying is that regardless of the sanctions and the whole hybrid warfare attacks that the US empire has waged on Cuba over the last 6 decades, Cuba is still recognized today as one of the best healthcare systems in the world. And in various rankings, it's literally rated the best healthcare system in the world. And there's various reasons behind that. One of them has been, of course, the emphasis that the state has put on healthcare and on developing healthcare technologies. That's something that you could see very early on. There's a quote here that I provide from Che Guevara that's given in a speech that he does a few months after the revolution triumphs. And he says that in the field of medicine, we're going to have to transform the doctor. Not only does he have the idea that you're going to have to transform the regular person into a socialist man or a socialist woman, which is something we've talked about before. We did a cadre formation school program on socialism and men in Cuba. But he also says we're going to have to transform the doctor into a revolutionary doctor, into a person who utilizes the technical knowledge of their profession in the service of the revolution and the people. And this is something that he's saying, a few months after the revolution. So there's already a consciousness of the necessity of professionals for the revolution. And in the same year as Che is giving that speech, Fidel Castro goes on to say that the future of Cuba will be a future of people of science, which is a quite bold claim for him to have made at that time, when more than half of Cuban professionals fled. That's the sort of fleeing that's called the flee of human capital. The technicians and the professionals had left Cuba. They had come to the U.S. as soon as the revolution hit, and it presented a real crisis. So in the middle of this crisis, for him to say that, our country is going to be a country filled with people of science and with educated professionals, it was quite a bold statement, but it shows the confidence that they had in developing in those areas, because they knew that they were going to prioritize state funding um, into those areas that are deeply human. They're deeply centered on human welfare and ensuring that the lives of people are as best as they can possibly be. And just to give you some statistics, for instance, in the University of Havana, the medical school, after the revolution, only 12 out of 250 Cuban teachers stayed. So that's well over 50%, which was the sort of medium. And University of Havana is like the main university in Cuba. It's the one that's highest ranked internationally. So that's sort of condition that Cuba had. And from that, in the last 6 decades, thanks to socialism, it's been able to develop one of the best healthcare systems in the world. It's been able to develop a surplus of doctors, which has allowed it to send brigades all across the world, saving hundreds of thousands, and in some estimates, millions of people from diseases that are tied to poverty and the effects of colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism on the nations of the global South. And it's done all of this largely for free, and at a at at a scale price according to how much a country makes. So for the poor nations, it's done it basically for free. One of the things that I wanted to mention is the method through which Cuba approaches medicine. And this is something that Eddie and I have talked about quite a few times. Eddie is obviously getting a master's in healthcare management, right?
Healthcare administration. Same.
Healthcare administration, yeah. And you get to see some of the contradictions of how questions are even approached or how questions are even formulated, and how replies, there seems to be a certain consistent logic to how replies to certain problems are given. And the logic is, once the problem arises, how do we treat the problem directly, and not how do we think about the roots of the problem? How do we think about preventing the appearance of the problem itself? So that is tied to a certain metaphysical view that penetrates bourgeois sciences and manifests itself in the medicines in various ways. For instance, just to reference the article on serotonin and depression that I had done earlier last year, the idea was that depression is linked to a chemical imbalance in the brain, a lack of serotonin. And what's the cure for that? Well, it's this medicine that we're going to promote the hell out of, that's going to be very, very profitable, that's going to create an industry that makes trillions and trillions of dollars in profits out of selling people pills and keeping them pilled up. So what happens there? You see a problem, you diagnose the problem in a way that the solution is always adding something, as opposed to analyzing things comprehensively, not reducing things to biochemical processes, as opposed to, instead of just reacting to the appearance of the problem, looking for the source of the problem and trying to adjust it from the roots. The opposite of that, it's what's done by medicine in the West, by bourgeois medicine. So Cuba does do that. They have a healthcare system that's innovative, preventative, it's people oriented as opposed to profit oriented. It's comprehensive. It treats individuals not as these monadic things that are separated from society. It looks at the individual in a dialectical relationship with society. It looks at the individual in certain levels of communities, in the family, in their immediate community, and how they relate to certain social trends that are national and international. It's community centered, and we're going to talk about that a little bit with the polyclinic model, which is quite special. It's internationalist, of course, it's shipping doctors around the world, and it's decommodified. It treats healthcare as a human right, as opposed to what we do here, where it really just becomes the privilege of whoever can afford it, or whoever ends up getting insurance, which, a big chunk of Americans don't have that privilege. So just a couple of things that I wanted to say about the blockade itself and how it affects Cuba in general before I talk about how it affects its medicine. It's
Well, can I jump in here for a sec,
Yeah.
Carlos, before you go on to the next part? I had a few comments I wanted to make about what you've said already.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Che Guevara can say that he's in favor of preventative medicine, but he was chain smoking cigars the whole revolution. So I don't know how preventative that is. But either way, yeah, I totally agree. And one of the things that, I mean, I would say you could say that Cuba has a use value based, from a Marxist perspective, or a value based healthcare system. This is something that's been devised in the American Healthcare Administration school of thought. How do we move from a fee for service system, a system where the hospitals make more money the more healthcare they sell you, to a system based on providing healthcare that has the highest value to the patient and provides the best health outcomes, which is the opposite of what we have in the US right now. We have the most expensive system with the worst health outcomes. So and the US health administrators are always get stuck on this question of how do we move to a value-based system? Well, you can't move to a system based on use value under capitalism. Capitalist production is the production of surplus value. So it makes sense that Cuba has been able to move to a value-based social system by moving towards socialism as a society. And then the other thing I had to say was um,
Well,
in
actually,
in relation to what you.
no, I was going to say actually before you get to that, Eddie, I had something that sort of ties into what you were saying. So it seems to me that this is a perfect example of the limitations of bourgeois ideology being based in the material class interests of the ruling class, right? This is a very good way to help us see how that happens. The bourgeois answer was like the one for depression, right? As Carlos was saying, a problem arises, and because the profit is the mechanism by which society's just reproducing itself, right? This is all that's looked at. And so the problem is only addressed on a way in which it creates a possibility for profit. And then you have the Cubans who don't have that limitation, who have a deeper worldview. And so instead of that and just addressing it in this individual metaphysical way, they look at, well, what caused this problem in the first place? And I always sort of explain to new people that that's the whole idea behind Marxism is what caused this in the first place? Get deeper than, oh, we have a problem, we need to fix it.
For sure, and that's exactly along the same lines of what I was going to say next. I was going to give an example, a specific example of how problems are conceptualized in terms of profits. Going back to what Carlos said about the method being different in Cuba than it is in the U.S., in the article I wrote about rural healthcare, there's a crisis of rural healthcare in the U.S. All these hospitals are shutting down. All these clinics are shutting down because it's not profitable to provide healthcare to low-income areas or less densely populated areas. It was the same thing in Cuba forever. In the Escambray, the rural regions of Cuba, especially in the Escambray, they really had no access to healthcare. It was like a 2-day walk at least if you wanted to get healthcare, and parents had to carry their children, that long ways. It was really a struggle. So how does Cuba look at this problem once they have the revolution? How do we get doctors to this area? How do we get nurses to this area? How do we build hospitals in these areas? How do we get administrators in these areas so we can run them, right? How do we get the resources and the labor that we need to these areas? And what they end up doing is saying you get free medical school if you go serve in the Escambray, if you go serve in the rural regions for a few years after you get it. So they create an incentive. But for the U.S., they've been completely ineffective at solving this problem. And actually, the problem has gotten worse at an accelerating pace in the last decade. But the way that you formulate this question in Western healthcare administration is how do we make it profitable to bring healthcare to the rural region? So going back to what Noah said about everything being conceptualized in terms of profit, right? It's how do we find a way to make profit off these rural residents, not how do we find a way to bring these rural residents healthcare? And that right there is the difference between capitalism and socialism. Capitalism is the production of surplus value.
One of the ways that I've theorized this, and the article on Cuba, it's much more, the article on the effects of the blockade on Cuba, it's much more like detail oriented. The one that I did on serotonin, it's much more an analysis of the worldview that permeates bourgeois sciences and why it is showing how that worldview is a fetter for the development of the sciences and why dialectical materialism as a higher form of scientific outlook would be preferable. And I cite studies that have been done in that Science for the People magazine, which just show in various areas in cancer research how when they shift the lens from analyzing things in a very reductive manner, in a static manner, in a reified manner, towards something that looks more like dialectical materialism, they've been able to just take off in terms of discoveries. But one of the things that I wanted to say just about that distinction is that really it gets at the heart of what medicine is supposed to be from the beginning. So it's a wholesale corruption. Once you commodify medicine, it's a wholesale corruption of what medicine itself is supposed to be. Because Hippocrates, the person who every person who becomes a doctor has to swear by the Hippocratic Oath. For him, the object of medical treatment is to treat whatever sicknesses come about, and most importantly, to treat the conditions which promote those sicknesses. So, that's what Cuba does. That's preventative uh, healthcare. But when you have the purpose of medicine as profit, the point of medical treatment is the proliferation of medicine itself, because more medical treatment means more profit. And that's antagonistic to what I call the auto-abolitional or the auto-destructive essence of medicine, which, when you look at medicine, what is its objective and is raison d'etre? It's sickness and the conditions which create sickness, and it tries to destroy that. It is in a dialectical relation to its opposite, which is sickness, and it's trying to destroy that. And in destroying those sicknesses, in a way, it destroys itself. So the objective of medicine, if it is able to fully fulfill it and create, a healthy society that can reproduce itself through healthy habits and eliminate a lot of the practices that lead to sicknesses, which are social and individual, and both at the same time, the objective of medicine is almost auto-destructive. It's to destroy the conditions which lead to the necessity of medicine itself. And that is in a complete antagonism to bourgeois medicine, which seeks to proliferate itself. And, this idea of the auto-destructive character of medicine, it's somewhat similar to how we think about like the party, right? Or the socialist state. In its development, it is destroying the conditions which out of which its own necessity arises, right? And it's just it's a basic dialectical law that in the destruction of the opposite upon which your existence is based on, you also destroy the conditions for your own existence. But this was something that was brought up by the Girondist statesman and doctor. His name was Francois Lantenas in 1792. In a book, he mentioned that the idea was, after the French Revolution, if we're really able to abolish war, to abolish poverty, to abolish the excesses in self-induced consumption that are seen in rich communities, if we're able to abolish sickness, we will also be abolishing medicine. So that was a very interesting idea, and I bring that up in another paper that's being published in Cuba, where I cite Eddie twice, two different references from Eddie. But just to get back to the topic at the ranch, which is the article and the effects.
Before you get back to that, though, Carlos, I think this is so central to how our society functions because of the importance of the medical industry and the American people mostly going without healthcare these days, right? It's really bringing to mind the proliferation of opiates, right? There's no incentive for doctors to actually treat your pain or whatever is causing it if they can keep selling you painkillers. And that evolved into the entire opiate epidemic, right? And I don't know, maybe it's just a little more personal for me with my family and my mom. She's been on thousands and thousands of dollars worth of prescriptions and various different insurances. It's bankrupted my family, all of this for 30 something years now. It's a travesty that capitalist society does this with people's lives.
I'm sorry, like I'm studying healthcare administration, so I get pretty passionate about it, and also had some long-term illness as a kid. I mean, this stuff, like everybody's got a personal story with the healthcare system because everybody needs healthcare, So it's like Noah's story about his family makes you sick to hear, but that's so many people, and 60% of the country has medical debt at some point. So it's not a healthcare system. It's not caring for people. It's straddling people with debt and literally making them unhealthy. And I just wanted to, I'll let you take over, Carlos. I just wanted to make sure it's clear that this is understood in Western healthcare administration. We just can't move to this because, profit dominates. the shareholders collecting surplus value and corporations dominate the system. This value-based concept, this idea of moving to value-based healthcare, which has been in Western healthcare administration for at least a decade, says that we need to focus on preventative medicine and social factors outside of just healthcare. So not just giving people pills to cover their symptoms, but finding them housing, finding them employment, making sure that they have a good social life and community, because we know for a fact that all of these things affect healthcare. But, instead of moving towards that, you have like in the US, there's this huge branch of alternative medicine with like acupuncture and chiro, and they're constantly butting heads with the mainstream medicine. And there should be, a dialectical middle ground. You should be able to go to a hospital and get acupuncture and, get prescribed pills if you need them. But that's neither here nor there. I'll let you get back to it, Carlos.
Well, that's what Carlos's article on serotonin was all about, right? I mean, it was that It's not just some chemical issue. There are factors that we can control outside of this and build things better that can actually attack the problem at its root. Sorry, I apologize for butting in. Go ahead, Carlos.
In a lot of ways, as Eddie mentioned, this was known in the scientific community. And the reason why it didn't come to the fore until 20 years after studies had been consistently showing in various areas that the idea that serotonin was the main cause for depression was untrue was because of the amount of money that was going into it. It was only after they were able to take 800 or so studies and do an umbrella study of all the other studies that it was, fully disproven that, you don't really get that sort of, you don't have that as the standard for the response from medicine. But I wanted to go back to just for folks that are not familiar with, I think a question that usually arises is why does the U.S. have a blockade on Cuba in the first place? And they've told us why repeatedly. But the first instance, when it was still being decided as to what would be the best steps to treat Cuba with, as it was nationalizing American companies, making those resources function for the Cuban people as opposed to profits for American and transnational capital. There's a memorandum that's given by Lester Mallory, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, and this is from 1960. So right at the beginning, as they're deciding what the best way to treat Cuba is, he says, every means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba. If such a policy, so the blockade, is adopted, it should be the result of a positive decision which would call forth a line of action which, while as adroit and inconspicuous as possible, makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. The only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and dissatisfaction based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. So this has been the same sort of logic behind every sanction regime and every blockade we've instituted. It's make the life of the people there as difficult as possible, because that's going to create the most fertile grounds for them rebelling against their government. But that's not all. They don't leave that rebellion to chance. They actively fund elements within Cuba in order to ensure that rebellion is guaranteed. So Tracy Eden from the Cuba Money Project has shown that in the U.S. has spent through USAID, so that's the U.S. Agency for International Development, the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, and the U.S. State Department, there's been more than $1 billion spent in the last decade to funding Cuban opposition groups, both in the U.S. and in Cuba. This has been done especially to reggaeton artists and people involved in reggaeton culture in Cuba. In Miami, this has been done through funding media, both radio media and TV media. Here in Miami, you have TV Martí and Radio Martí, which is very weird because they use the figure of Martí, which is also known in Cuba as the apostle of the revolution. It's seen as the figure that's like kind of the precondition for the development of socialism, the main figure in thinking about the struggle against Spanish colonialism. So those are the two forms through which the U.S. is attacking Cuba, and the reason why it is attacking it. There are, of course, many other forms. We have linked to the description of the video a lecture that I did on the 26th of July, describing really the history of Cuba and all the specific forms of hybrid warfare that the U.S. wages on Cuba. So if you want to learn more about that, you can go check that lecture out and the other article that I did on the subject out. But that's what Cuba's kind of having to deal with, and that's the purpose of the US's blockade. But even as that's the condition that Cuba is in, because of the emphasis that the state lays on healthcare, because of the use value that it has, they've been able to develop extremely into an extremely successful healthcare system, a model for other nations, even developed nations, and have been able to create a very large surplus of doctors. It is the country that has the most doctors per capita in the world, and it has sent these doctors around the world for basically free and at a sliding scale for countries that are not amongst the poorest countries. There have been, Helen Yaffe writes, millions of human beings in the poorest corners of the earth who can say that they owe their health and sometimes their life to Cuban professionals and the government that sent and trained them. Um, the most important staple of Cuban medicine develops in the 1970s, though, after they had already made, two or three generations of doctors, which was the polyclinic model. And it was a new model of community-based polyclinics that their whole purpose was to develop comprehensive care in neighborhoods. I mentioned that we're moving. I was recently watching old cassette videos from when I was a baby in Cuba, and there was a lady that was always there with the family. She was always carrying me, and I was like, "Is that someone from the family who I didn't know?" And my mom's like, "No, that was the polyclinic nurse." So, like, communities had folks like this that were in the everyday life world of people, ensuring that their habits were healthy, ensuring that if anything small popped up, they could catch it early to prevent things from getting out of hand to the point where Western medicine likes to receive people, which is when they automatically need treatment and medical intervention. So I'll stop there and maybe we can keep going after.
This is actually the part when I was trying to skim it before this that really caught my eye, because it's almost absurd for Americans to think about this sort of thing existing.
Right.
Like a doctor just in your neighborhood that's there making sure that things are going in a healthy manner, that addresses problems as they come up. That's so far outside the realm of what we could expect here as to sound like a fantasy to me, and I really like the way you put it. Like you talk about how that developed in 71 or 74, I forget what it was. And then you talk about how here, I can look for it. They emphasize a dialectical relationship of the individual and in their community, right, and of the biological needs of that community to the social. This comes from a deep Marxist analysis of how to approach these problems, and that's what I think a lot of people, as they're sort of thinking about these things, don't get, that everything they do is informed by the science of Marxism. And that's really, really, really important.
Yeah, and it's vital to understand the social connection to healthcare, the factors outside of, just disease and healthcare. There's so many different things that lead a person to become sick or lead to poor health outcomes. And Howard Waitskin wrote this book. This is a Marxist analysis of the U.S. healthcare system from a while ago, where he basically says that every doctor has to treat sickness that people are induced by under capitalism. They're overworked, they're exploited, they're alienated, and they're anxious because of that, or very likely physically unhealthy. Due to terrible food production, unsafe working conditions, pollution, all these things. So it's then the doctor's job to fix, a sickness, but the doctor's not allowed to say, okay, take the next few weeks off of work. You know, they can't actually fix the social issues that are causing the sickness. So then the easiest thing becomes, I'll give you opioids or I'll give you amphetamines. And
Keep you going,
one
making the boss rich, right?
right, and one of the things that Carlos mentioned was the Cuban doctors getting sent all around the world to help other countries. One of my favorite stories from COVID, well, not favorite because it's sad for the Brazilian people, but Bolsonaro expelled all the Cuban doctors and claimed that they were actually terrorists who had been sent by the communist government to infiltrate Brazil. But then, when Brazil's hospitals and clinics were overrun by sick patients during COVID-19, Bolsonaro said, "Oh, wait a second. Can you please send those doctors back? We need them now." So that's crazy that he wanted terrorists in his own country. You know, it's weird that all those doctors were terrorists, but he would want them to come run the hospitals for him.
It's one of the most sickening things because these are people who are highly celebrated as heroes in Cuba because of their efforts, you know, and the the way that the U.S. treats them as slaves of Cuba is so demeaning and so incredibly disrespectful, and it's disgusting, frankly, because these are people that are seen as heroes. They don't, maybe they see themselves as heroes, maybe not, but they're seen as heroes by the Cuban people, and the U.S. just for political reasons. Oh no, these are slaves of the Cuban regime in order so that the regime can exert its influence around the world through doctors. It's just despicable.
Right. This evil influence to keep people healthy, you know.
They do that with reading too. Like,
Mhm.
these mischievous, nefarious communists are trying to teach people how to read.
Well,
Don't teach us
that's
poor how to
authoritarian to
read.
make somebody go to the library. You know.
Right, right. But another thing that's perhaps worth mentioning is that um, whereas not only do you have this difference of outlook, which allows one to be more effective than the other. And not only do you have the limitations of the for-profit model at the point of service and actual medical practice, but the training of professionals is also very different. And who gets to train? If you're a doctor in the U.S., likelihood is that you're graduating with probably $500,000 in debt. It's like 12 years of study, and it's very tedious work, and it costs a bunch of money, even if you're an amazing student and you have perfect grades. I have family members who have graduated with with the doctor's degrees in pharmacy, and they're $450,000 in debt, and they've been straight A students their whole academic career. That's obviously not the case in Cuba. Education there has been free, and both their free universal education and their free universal healthcare system have kind of fed off of each other, and the development of one has produced a development in the other. And that's something that, as I mentioned, the revolution emphasized very, very early on, to the point where I still remember, I've said it before, one of the reasons why the wheels started moving in my head towards socialism was because people in Miami, where I had grown up, were telling my mom to go to Cuba to get treatment. When, she had my sister, she had fibromes issues and she could have died, or ended up going in tremendous debt. And the same people who shit on Cuba 24/7, who do nothing but bring up tyranny and dictatorship and murderers and political prisoners in every sentence that Cuba's mentioned, those are the same people who now out of nowhere are telling my mom, just go to Cuba and get the operation. It didn't make any sense, but that's a reality for many people in from the Cuban diaspora who know about that, and others who have been perhaps informed through other means, especially people who suffer from diabetes, cancers, and these other, illnesses and diseases which Cuban healthcare is at the cutting edge of in terms of research. So that's perhaps what I was planning on jumping to next. But you know, what has Cuba been able to do? It's got a population that's the healthiest and longest, one of the longest living in the world. They live 3 years longer than Americans. So just picture that in your head. This massive empire with basically infinite resources. Their people live 3 years less than the small island that has been blocked by that massive empire for 60 years. Um, the life
It's
increase.
it's really, really important to always keep in mind that they do all of these amazing things under the most brutal economic blockade in history. They're prevented from, as they're sending doctors all over the world during COVID, our government, our ruling class was trying to prevent them getting the materials they needed to give their own people vaccines. It's
Right.
absolutely disgusting what's done to them, and still they triumph over it. That's incredibly admirable.
Yeah, I actually wanted to comment on that when we were talking about the blockade, and I didn't get a chance. But it's literally old-fashioned siege tactics,
Mhm.
right? Like we will starve these people, we will take these people's medicine so that they can't, keep their people healthy, and then hopefully the people rise up and overthrow the government. We're actively going to try and foment that. And Vijay Prashad talks about in Washington Bullets, like these embargoes, they're stopping other countries from trading, right? The U.S. sanctions, they prevent any trade from going in or out. How do you demand that other countries stop trading? How do you enforce that? Well, ultimately, it is enforced by the global financial system, which is dominated by the U.S., but really it's enforced by the U.S. military. That's why we have 1,000 bases around the world. Everywhere we have a bank, a foreign bank, it's backed up by a foreign military base. So it's literally, we're going to surround you with our military and take all your medicine to try and, make your people more sick so they'll overthrow your government that we don't like. It's the same as freaking in the medieval ages when they would like catapult cows into people's castles to make them sick and
Mhm.
spread disease. It's literally a new form of that. Like the US, I bet you the US military surrounding Cuba and in the Caribbean is going to just start shooting cows into Cuba and Venezuela any day now.
Well, they did that in the, I believe it was either the late 70s or early 80s with the African swine fever flu that destroyed Cuban harvests and Cuban livestock. Um, and, people have the gall to criticize people who, having known this history of the U.S. willingness to use, diseases as a form of warfare,
Mhm.
question the appearance of the pandemic and who's behind it and all that. But
What's
yeah,
really
absolutely, it's definitely a David and Goliath effort. And when you look at the statistics and what it's been able to accomplish, even when measured not just against its past before socialism, not just against other countries that are poor in the Western Hemisphere, but even against the U.S. Like that statistic that Cubans are living 3 years more than Americans, it's mind-boggling. But you have another situation where since the revolution, the increase in life expectancy has been 16 years. So Cubans are living 16 years more thanks to socialism. Infant mortality was reduced from 6 to 0.41%. So I mean, just think about that. The level of reduction that has occurred, and that 0.41% makes it the lowest in the Western Hemisphere. That means that infant mortality in Cuba is a lot lower than it is in the U.S. You have infectious diseases like polio, malaria, neonatal tetanus, measles, rubella, mumps, whooping cough, and dengue, which are frequently found in the poorest places of the world. Those have all been eradicated in Cuba a long, long time ago because of their socialist healthcare system. They have made the most prodigious inroads in cancer, HIV, and diabetes research. With regards to lung cancer, the best known innovation is the CEMAVAX vaccine, which was created by researchers at the Havana Center for Molecular Immunology. And it acts on the growth factor of cancer cells to prevent the disease from spreading. So the most common death from cancer is lung cancer, which kills around 1.8 million people worldwide each year. And with the US blockade in place, thousands of Americans are deprived the prolongation and enhancement of their lives with the CEMAVAX vaccine. Uh, During the Obama era, Cuban thaw, when the blockade wasn't removed, but it was partially lifted in certain areas, especially the more important areas. There was some clinical trials and some collaborations in states like New York and in other places. But that was all removed when Trump reinstated the blockade and when it was continued and in various areas proliferated with the Biden administration. Um, but in doing that, they not only affect Cuba, which is one of the main things I want to talk about today. They also affect Americans because there's hundreds of thousands of Americans who are going to lose the hope that the CIMAVAX vaccine presented for their lung cancer, right? And it's a hope not just for better lives, but for life itself. So this is a blockade that not only affects Cubans, it also affects a hell of a lot of Americans. And we know that the US government, which is supposed to represent the people, it really doesn't represent the people. It represents a very small interest of monopoly finance capitalists. And it's shown in the past. For instance, I'm forgetting the name um, of the affair, but in the 60s, it was willing to go to the point of bombing various cities in the US itself, bombing cities in the US, killing innocent American people in order to blame it on Cuba to use that as a justification for war against Cuba. So if it was contemplating that in a very serious manner in the 60s, it's not a surprise that it's willing to have its people die from lung cancer and from cancer in general through a blockade that prevents them from getting access to CIMAVAX.
Or COVID-19 for that matter.
Right, right. Or the COVID-19 vaccines that Cuba created five. Three of them were made viable. They were. It was said that they were viable very quickly. Um, a lot of them don't have the effects that you have with Pfizer and with the Moderna vaccine. But just like CIMAVAX, there's Rakutomobab, which is a name, a mouthful, but and VSSP, which are other leading drugs that they're using to prevent cancer. And the Rakutomobab one targets a molecule that scientists believe is found in all cancer cells, meaning that the drug could one day be an effective uh, it can be effectively used against leukemia and the tumors which accompany lung, breast, colon, and prostate cancers. So again, a drug that can potentially, if it's developed openly with the scientific community of the world, save millions and millions of lives. And VSSP, which was originally designed as a compound to activate the immune responses to vaccines, also appears to stimulate the immune responses against cancer. Both of these drugs, which are being tested and developed, the U.S. community has no access to. American scientists have no access to working with Cuban scientists in the development of these vaccines. So, talk about the capitalist relations of production in the state of neo-imperialism being a fetter to the development of the sciences. So, yeah, I guess we can stop here before maybe discuss a little bit of what's said before we go to the next one.
Yeah, I think it's wild to see how the blockade also affects Americans, and it's wild to see how the Cuban healthcare system outperforms ours in so many ways. Because we
Mm.
have the most expensive and most technologically advanced system, but we have these terrible health outcomes. And this country, who we've been holding under the most stringent economic embargo on earth for the last 70 years, has better outcomes than us. Like this one comment here says, according to the NIH, the National Institute for Health, an American government agency, Cubans aged 1 to 15 see rates of malnutrition at around 0.7%. And who even knows if that's accurate? That's from a U.S. government institution. In the United States, the same group statistics are at 5%. 5. So, well over 4% percentage points higher in terms of malnutrition under an embargo, right? Under an embargo in a country that for years was colonized and only really grew sugar and tobacco. So, that's what their soil adjusted to, and it became monocropic and only wanted to grow those crops. Even despite that, using innovative agricultural techniques and, all these different planting methods, they've been able to outperform the U.S. in malnutrition, child malnutrition by a lot. I mean, that's the authoritarianism and the evils of capitalism. If you support capitalism, you support malnutrition.
And
according to the logic of the anti-communists.
just to piggyback on that comment about monocropping, colonial enforced monocropping, it destroyed the land and made 75% of the otherwise arable land unarable. So they can't grow. They haven't been able to grow anything successfully there. They're still, trying their best to diversify. But it's also the fact that from the mid 19th century on, that monocropping was also tied to selling most of the produce to the U.S. So it's a blockade that obviously means that Cuba can't trade with what had become its natural, because of geography, its natural trading partner for over a century. It can't trade with the U.S., and because of the U.S.'s global hegemony, it also prevents other countries from not being able to trade with Cuba, at least in terms that are fair in terms of market practices. Because what often ends up happening is that Cuba has to buy things above market price and sell them below market price in order so that it's worth those people that are engaging in trade with Cuba the effects that trading with Cuba would mean for it in terms of the U.S.'s repercussions against it.
One thing that really stuck out to me is how Cuba has sort of innovated ways to be self-sufficient despite all of this arable land just being unusable, right? Or becoming non-arable, however you call it. And one of the really interesting things they did was neighborhoods, apartment buildings, things like this had gardens on their rooftops, like entire greenhouses, whole communities involved in these projects. And that sort of thing that's possible in a socialist society that, I mean, if you look at some of the leftist groups here that do a community garden, it's like 3 sad bean plants and a tomato plant that barely works, right? Or that barely grows. They're not real issue. They're not a real way for a community to be self-sufficient. Like, let's be real. It's a few hipsters having chickens in their backyard, right?
I hope all of that is targeted towards Eddie because he kept up a Marxist garden for
I
quite a
was
while.
gonna say,
It
are
was
you
pretty
hating on my
successful.
gardening right now? I
I,
have so many tomatoes. Had so many tomatoes.
And
you
peppers
should
and
see
shit.
my backyard. It's all an abandoned garden because I'm not good
You're
at it.
just salty. That's why you're bringing it up because you weren't able to grow stuff successfully. But I did. Jacob did. I had forgotten the name, but it's the Operation Northwood. That was the operation that they were considering doing terrorist acts on U.S. soil to blame it on Cuba and use that as justification for war with Cuba. And I mentioned earlier that I have this lecture that I gave for the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies that we have uploaded on the Midwestern Marx YouTube. If you look up Midwestern Marx and the 26th of July, it's like the first one that pops up, but we linked it to the description of this live stream as well, so you can check that out. And I also talk about it in this other article I did for the Covert Action magazine during the time when the July 11th protests had occurred. So, but I
You know,
can.
oh, I'm sorry. I keep interrupting. I'm sorry, man. Just talk over me. But what that really reminded me of was I always think about all these things that our government and the NGOs it creates and things like that, how they attack other countries. If other countries would even do a small, tiny fraction of these kind of things, it would be blown so far out of proportion. It'd be all out war. I mean, imagine if Cuba got caught discussing how to assassinate our leaders, or how to overthrow our government. Imagine if China were funding NGOs and activist organizations in the U.S. centered at we hate the U.S. government, we want socialism, which would be the equivalent of what they do. It's absolutely bananas that nobody talks about that.
And they've also harbored terrorists. Like people like Luis Posada Garriles, who blew up a plane along with other folks of his ilk, killing 72 people. It was a Cuban airline plane. And, a lot of these people are celebrated by the most extreme segments of anti-Cuba sentiments in in the Gusano community in Miami, which, with younger generations, it's kind of changing. We've seen it change. There's caravans happening every last Sunday of every month, hosted by the Puente de Amor folks and our friends from Troika Collective. They're always there, participating, promoting those caravans, and they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the protesters against the caravan are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And the smaller they get, the more violent they get, the more hateful and resentful they get. They've punched, some of our friends at Troika Collective for protesting against the blockade and asking just for the blockade to be lifted. And the slogan of the other group, Puente de Amor, it literally means a bridge of love. So you have this stark contrast, a bridge of love, and then, the most despicable form of hatred that just, punches people and throws stuff at their car and hits their cars when they're trying to do this caravan. So that's a stark contrast, but I think it's helpful because it shows any rational human being the sort of character of the people who think those myths about Cuba are true. And you saw that recently with the World Baseball Classic. I mean, the sort of protests that they were doing against the players and against the Cuban government, which they saw being symbolized by the players who were playing the ball game. And there was a small delegation of Cubans at the stadium, and these people were literally throwing stuff at them. And it was kids, it was old people that were in that delegation. It's the most despicable thing ever. But I think that they show their cowardice. They show their lack of character and their lack of integrity, and in connection to that, the poverty of the way that they view the world and the way that they view Cuba in their actions. So in a way, it's very self-defeating, because it's, who are you going to trust? The decent people that are there, with their family trying to watch a baseball game, not reacting negatively to this hatred that they're receiving, telling the cops, no, it's okay, we'll stay here, it's fine. Are you going to trust those people, which seem a whole lot more rational, or the idiots that are, throwing stuff at them? That you look at just the way that they compose themselves is very lumpen, in the sense of engaging in criminal activities as a way to subsist, which it's forced upon them by capitalism. But they still have these views about Cuba, which are completely based on just myths and on lies and on nothing substantial. Who are you going to trust? So in those actions, they show who they really are, and any rational observer that's not already in an a priori manner destined to have their conclusion knows who in what place truth lies.
Well said, brother. So well said. While you were saying that, we got a super chat from Sam Dixon, who has a riddle for us. He says, a Marxist riddle for Eddie Noah Carlos, who is a beloved Marxist we all love, who is not a Christian, but a father of one. Hint, they're still alive.
I think I know who it is.
I'm assuming we all do. Think about it for 1 second, Carlos. You'll get it.
Do you have an idea, Carlos, or are you the only one without a guess?
I mean, I was gonna guess Eddie.
He's not just a father, but also a parent.
Let me say, that was a giveaway. Let me say the first name and you say the last name, Noah. Michael
Parenti.
Father of Christian Parenti.
Well done, Sam. His father's a Christian. Okay.
That was a good one, Sam. Thank you for that one.
Good. We have comrade Professor Danny Shaw in the chat as well. His lectures have been amazing. He just did one on Bukele in Salvador, which is really, really good. That we're
fantastic
in the next couple of days. Carlos doesn't know. Yes, I'm embarrassed, but it's the Christian thing that got me. It had me thinking about like religion.
Carlos had like a liberation theology book open. He's like, hold on, it's just 300 pages. Let me read this quick. I know it's in here somewhere.
He's going through the mental archive. Yeah.
He turned it into a whole research project.
But it could also be Eddie, because your dad's Christian. You're a Marxist that we love, and it fits all the same characteristics.
Yeah, but he's
dad would have to be the Marxist we love, though. So
right, it would have to be my son.
Maybe you're talking about my son. I don't know, but who loves me? Ooh. You seen this face? Unlovable.
I maybe read it wrong, but okay, we can go back to the thing. I want to talk about now the inroads that they've made in terms of diabetes medicine. Um, the main one, it's one that's called a miracle treatment. That's been what they've been calling it. It's called Heberprop Heberprot P. They got to change the names of these medicines, man, because they're hard to remember. They're hard to just say. Period. They got to just call it like diabetes medicine.
You
Diabetes
actually
medicine.
All
have
medications have real bad names.
You
Horrible.
actually have to take a class on that for healthcare administration before they let you into the program. You have to take a medical terminology course with like a community college.
It's
Like
like
just
how
how to say all these ridiculous words.
And they mean the simplest things. They're just
It's
so
kind of like
long.
learning Marxist jargon, you know?
But anyways, when uncontrolled damages to the nerves and blood vessels happen in a person's foot, it can cause the disease to have more debilitating complications like diabetic foot ulcers, which are capable of also penetrating the bone. These ulcers can become gangrenous, and in the worst case, can be the cause of amputation of a finger, a foot, or sometimes even a leg. Since 2006, Cuba has had this miracle drug, Herperbrat P, which avoids the need to amputate. Um, its inventors are scientists from the Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology in Havana, and they described this treatment as an epidermal growth factor that is injected next to the affected area and can accelerate the skin's healing process, closing the wound in about 3 months. It has shown about an 80% success rate in preventing amputation, which is an incredible fact considering that up to 60% of amputations lead to death within 5 years and up to 80% within 10 years. In the US, diabetes is the seventh most common cause of death, affecting more than 1 in 10 adults, and prediabetes affecting 1 in 3. Each year, 1.4 million Americans are diagnosed with diabetes, and more than 100,000 die from the disease. Nonetheless, this treatment, Herperbrat P, which is a treatment that, according to Manuel Raices, who's the communications executive at the Cuban Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology, could reduce the risk of U.S. amputations in half, saving tens of thousands of lives in the U.S. a year. This treatment is prevented from being used in the U.S. because of the blockade. So again, when you combine cancer treatment, HIV treatment, and diabetes treatment, you have easily well over 100,000 Americans who are dying needlessly because they don't have treatments which have been developed in Cuba, and they don't have access to it because of their government's blockade on Cuba.
Diabetes especially is really horrible to look at how it's treated. Think about if we were able to get this medication and this process, it could change people's lives, and it could be done at minuscule cost to people, if any. Right? It reminds me of when insulin was first created. Right? The creator of insulin, and I forget his name right now.
Frederick Banting.
Thank you, Eddie. He said, this doesn't belong to me. This belongs to the people. I'm not going to profit off of this. And then what happened? Right? How much does insulin cost now that these corporations have gotten a hold of it and sank their vampire teeth into it? It's people literally die without their insulin, right? It's absolutely disgusting what is done in the name of profits. And it's not like people are evil, right? This is simply how it works. As this system goes on, it needs to do this to keep going, which is why I'm not going to get into a whole thing, but yeah, absolutely gross to think about that stuff.
Yeah, Carlos and I have probably more subjective stories about people struggling, having to ration their insulin than we even have objective stats. Like one of the people we organized with the most closely in the Bernie campaign told us stories about people sending their insulin in the mail to each other they basically have formed mutual aid networks to get each other insulin. It's like like Noah said, a patent that the inventor sold for $1, because he said when he sold that patent, insulin doesn't belong to me, it belongs to the world. Well, I guess that's not how it works under capitalism, because now it belongs to the pharmaceutical companies. And Bernie Sanders a while back tried to get a bill passed that would allow cheaper drugs to be imported from Canada, but it was blocked by Democratic Senator Cory Booker, who takes more money from the pharmaceutical industry than anybody in the Democratic Party. And then he said he had to do it because he was worried about safety regulations, even though Canada's safety regulations are stricter than ours. They're stricter than the Food and Drug Administration in the U.S. So just a blatant lie. And then we actually at the college,
as if Canada's just like producing whatever willy-nilly, right?
Right. Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
not
We just
technologically
wanted to bring, meth from a meth lab in Canada over. Bernie Sanders was going to smuggle it himself, and the Honorable Cory Booker brought a stop to it. But
Thank God for Cory Booker. Oh.
We had a social work professor who I thought I looked up to and I thought I respected, because he, we were a little naive, or I was naive in undergrad, and he was a professor and someone you look up to. And I remember him door knocking for Cory Booker against Bernie Sanders in the primary, the Democratic primary. And I'm like, you are literally, so you're a social work professor, and one of the core tenets of social work is advocacy. You advocate for those who cannot advocate for themselves, aka people who have diabetes and have, not enough money, so they have to ration their insulin. That's exactly who a social work professor is supposed to advocate for. But what was this social work professor who runs for office every year in our area doing? He was out here fighting for the candidate who takes more money than anyone else from the pharmaceutical industry against the only candidate in this corrupt, horrible-ass Democratic Party who wanted to give people health care. Right? He's actively fighting against health care for the people that he's supposed to care about. And that just shows the opportunism of a lot of these professional managerial class, AOC type progressives who talk a lot about healthcare and how bad the system is. But then when it's convenient to sell out to the pharmaceutical company, they'll do it because they're cowards at politician Kavanaugh. I'll say his name, Brad Kavanaugh. Fuck you, dude.
Not only are they cowards, but their class interests, like they don't have to worry about buying insulin.
Right.
So what does it matter to them? Right.
I want to go back to a comment that you said that, these people are not just evil, and quote the great Edward Liger, real middle name Smith, in an article about the failure of healthcare in rural America. He says companies cannot prioritize population health outcomes even if they wanted to. Market competitions reward those who sell the most healthcare at the greatest margins, but harshly punish those who would bring healthcare to a population of people who can't afford to pay both the cost of the healthcare services provided as well as the profits of the private shareholders who own the facilities providing care.
Not only that, they have to make up for the falling rate of profit within their financialized assets too. So it gets skyrocket high, healthcare especially. And it leads doctors, it leads HMOs, giant hospital corporations like the Cleveland Clinic, who controls most of Cleveland, by the way. Horrible company. But anyway, it leads them to basically rip you off. If you guys don't mind, I have like a small story about a dentist in this area. I have a very weird issue with teeth, right? Like I need to be put under for a dentist to even look at my teeth. So it led to me like having all these problems, and I still have to get implants. And so I finally work up and it takes years to do this. And it's at the same time that I have insurance. So I'm finally doing it. And I go through all these steps and like 4 different appointments with this guy. He like did a not a general anesthesia, but a basic sedation where I was like, I think they call it twilight, I forget, for like all the exams. And then finally the day of the first surgery comes and I'm so excited. And I call him the day before. I'm like, hey, do I have to, stop taking medications? When do I eat? What am I doing? And he goes, what do you mean? You're not getting anesthesia. You're not going under. And I'm like, the entire thing has been about that. What are you talking about? And then Literally, the office stopped taking my calls because I kept calling, trying to reschedule. All of that just to get all those insurance company checks, right? They knew from the beginning they weren't set up to monitor someone under anesthesia, and
Mhm.
kept me stringing along to get that paid. It's so gross. And it's not like the guy like was a horrible person. He was super nice. I'm sure the company just needed to do that. And that's what they're forced to do. It's
I
really messed up, man.
I remember you told me that story because I was telling you about the experience of
Mm.
my wife going to the dentist, and we're obviously extremely poor, so we have the insurance that covers like the most.
Mm.
And my wife, mother, she goes to the dentist, and she has to pay $40 to get seen, and then they tell her, okay, we have to do these 2 or 3 things to your teeth to fix you up. And when they check the insurance, in order for her to get the thing that she needed, she would still have to pay $500, even if it covered, 70% of it. Um, so the check was just like literally nothing. Like they did nothing. She had to pay $40 in order to be told that if she wanted to get fixed, she had to pay an amount of money that obviously we don't have the
Mhm.
money to pay for. So it's this real douchebaggery that's just sort of enforced systematically on these agents, and they might be great people when they leave the office, but it's a real ripoff, and it's
Yeah,
just because of the profit system.
precisely. It's set up to do as little as possible and get as much as possible. That's just the general way things work in capitalism.
Yeah, and one of the things people will bring up, I see this comment here. It's very sad. It says, "I'm sure that no one needs to hear this, but yes, in fact, the U.S. will absolutely let its citizens die from lack of health care. My father died this way." And very sorry to hear that, comrade. That's exactly the kind of thing we're fighting against here, because it's unnecessary for anyone to die like that. But there's some law that says you're not allowed to turn away anybody who needs emergency care. The clinics can, but the ERs can't, which is actually
Mm,
in healthcare administration, the hospitals are real upset about that they have to treat all of these homeless people and stuff because it cuts into their bottom line and their profit. So they're devising new ways to kick homeless people out. But it's like if someone comes in and they're like they've got like a knife in their chest, yeah, you can't turn them away if you're an ER. But like if you have cancer, they don't have to give you chemo for free, right? They don't have to give you these long-term treatments for free for, diseases that kill most people, like heart diseases, cancer, things like that. So this argument that idiots make claiming that they have to turn you, or, I mean, they won't turn anyone away, they won't let anyone die in the US because there's a law. Absolutely ridiculous. And not only are there tons of subjective stories to prove that wrong, but the academic or the literature academic literature proves that wrong. It's
Mm.
anywhere estimated from 40 to 80,000 people die every year in the U.S. Due to lack of insurance. And I mean, anytime we talk about healthcare, like I said, the anecdotal stories are going to come out, but I think they're good because they show, the way that these systemic issues affect our everyday lives, which is, shows how important it is to fight against them. But my brother he tore both his ACLs in the last 3 years, and we've gotten better at dealing with the PT services and the people that he needs to deal with. But the first time he needed physical therapy, my mom had to call the insurance company 30 times.
Jesus.
30 times to get the PT set up and get it paid for when my dad's a teacher. So we have, good health insurance compared to most of America. Well, I'm going to be 26 soon, so RIP to that for me.
Uh-oh.
But my brother gets it. And what we figured out, my mom was like, "Oh, they were just trying to ditch me. They were trying to get me to give up, right? They were running me in a circle. Oh, you got to call this person. You got to call that person. You got to call this department. What they're trying to do is get you to give up, so they don't have to pay for your health care, which is why,
Exactly.
yeah, Medicare for all would save millions of dollars in administrative costs and bureaucracy costs because there are people who are paid just to run you around in a circle until you give up. And one more anecdotal story that's just tiny. I have a broken tooth right now. I have for like a couple months, or probably a year. I wish I could show you. I can't probably. My back molar is completely like destroyed from wrestling. And I called the dentist the other day, and they're like, if you call us next week Wednesday, which was like 8 days from when I called, if you call us exact or first thing in the morning when you wake up, when we open at like 7 p.m. or whatever, you might be able to get in to get your tooth fixed and get your wisdom teeth out sometime within the next few months. It's like, well, what is with all these people then telling us we can't have Medicare for all? We can't have a nationalized public healthcare system because of wait times. Oh, the wait times in Canada. Like, my freaking teeth are rotting out of my head, and I can't get into a dentist for 2 months in America. Like, don't fucking talk to me about wait times.
You know, I have a similar issue with my PT that I did. I live with a herniated disc in my neck, just from work. I can't. And the worst part about it is, if I tried to get surgery, it could make it worse. And I can't take opiates because of my past, so I just deal with the pain. One of the things that really helped was my insurance paid for 1 week of physical therapy. Getting that set up took me about 2 weeks, right? It was just call after work, get confused, try to figure out who to call next and when, then give up for the night over and over again, right? But I want to go back to that ER thing again, because another really horrible thing this causes, the way they do that, is it overcrowds ERs because people know that that's the only way they can get a thing treated sometimes. And so that's their option. They go into the ER, and then the ER doctors have all this excess. And of course they're trying to, keep their jobs and kick out the people that don't have insurance. That's what they're told to do. And it's just a disgusting way to run it. My mother-in-law is a nurse and complains about these kind of things all the time.
Yeah, it's interesting. The nurses have been like the most revolutionary group of workers in the American healthcare system, as far as unionizing, fighting for Medicare for all and stuff.
National
Sam
Nurses United.
Yeah, that's the name of the union that's done. They were huge with the Bernie campaign, as far as like not just like supporting Bernie, but like good education and like these good events and information about Medicare for all and single payer and how it works. We need to go farther than single payer healthcare, but and Sam Dixon makes a great point here, and thanks for the super chat, Sam. But
Thanks, Sam.
health, dental, and eye are often kept separate. Which what was it Medicare or Medicaid didn't include dental care for the longest time, or that was something Bernie was trying to get added to Medicare? Like, yeah, we'll pay for old people's health care, but not their teeth. Like they have dentures, they don't need tooth care.
And eye care doesn't go all the way too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's just in like unnecessary fragmentation designed at not paying for people's healthcare, ripping them off.
But in terms of study, that it gets us back to the bourgeois outlook in the sciences, which likes to separate everything from everything else and not see things comprehensively and in their interconnection. Of course, here, because institutionally it's more profitable to separate them and make each its own thing and make money from each separately. In doing that, you can make more. But by the way, I don't know if any of you guys have seen, there's a great movie from Denzel Washington, John Q, which depicts the sort of headaches and very sad stories that you get with the American healthcare system. It's, I think, it's 20 years old now. So this is, again, a problem that has been ongoing for a very long time. But to circle back to Cuba, I talked a little bit about how Cuban medicine has developed to such a great extent, even under extremely difficult conditions imposed on it by U.S. hybrid warfare, and more specifically sanctions. And then I also talked about how part of the developments that it's had have been excluded from being shared to the American public, which has meant that at least 100,000 or more people are dying each year in the U.S. because they don't have access to Cuban medicines that are HIV, diabetes, and cancer related. But now I want to turn a little bit to the concrete effects that Cuba faces when because of the blockade, and some of the more detailed ways that the blockade functions. So at the more abstract level, the blockade has cost Cuba over the last 6 years $1.3 trillion, which for being a small island, how it is, the amount of things that it would have been able to do uh, without having lost that money is just incredible, right? And in the short period of 2 to 3 years during the Cuban thaw process with Obama, it was able to develop. It was one of the fastest developing countries in the region, had one of the highest GDPs, and that growth was, of course, seen in all parts of society, not just at the top. It was a GDP metric that actually meant something for people, unlike ours here in the U.S. But there's a variety of ways that the blockade affects Cuba, and just to reiterate, this is a blockade that has been condemned by virtually every country on the planet at the United Nations General Assembly over the last 30 years. And the last vote was in November 2022, and 185 countries voted in favor of lifting the blockade. Only the U.S. empire and the apartheid state of Israel voted against it. But Cuba's ministry for public health says that Cuba's denied the right to acquire technologies, raw materials, reagents, diagnostic means, medicines, devices, equipments, and spare parts necessary for the best functioning of its national health system, which would be obtained in geographically distant markets or through a third country with an increase in cost. Right. So again, because it can't get them through the regular means, it has to participate in buying them in the market in a very unfavorable manner, buying higher than usual, and sometimes selling its goods higher than usual. Technologies from the U.S. or from countries and companies that have more than 10% funding from that country cannot be acquired by the island. So whatever, if Cuba wants to buy from a company, say in Switzerland, and that company has 10% of American capital, the sanctions regime would affect that company. In some cases, it is necessary to send patients abroad at much higher costs than doing the procedure in national territory because the technologies are not available. Um, there are a plethora of examples to point to where the blockade prohibits Cuba from assessing medicine, technology, equipment, and other things it would need to save the lives of hundreds of thousands of Cubans. American companies and manufacturers of more than 10% of American capital frequently ignore and sometimes explicitly reject Cuba's request for purchasing their products. Um, from January to July 2021, the medical products import and export company called MediCuba SA contacted 65 U.S. companies to inquire about the possibility of importing medicines, equipments, and devices and other supplies necessary for the care of the Cuban people through their national health system. Of these, 56 did not respond to the request of the Cuban entity, and 3 responded negatively. And those 3 were Owens and Minor Incorporated, Mercury Medical, and Eli Lilly, who I'm sure that we're all familiar with. The Omeda, General Electric, and Hewlett Packard companies were asked for multi-purpose mechanical ventilators for newborns and infants, as well as for multi-purpose cardio monitors, which include blood pressure monitoring, amongst other parameters, and its acquisition has not been made possible because of the blockade. In the same way, the One Lambda company was asked for its kits for HLA typing, essential to determine the compatibility of a kidney transplant candidate with possible donors. They could not be acquired either because of the blockade. Some 158,800 Cuban patients, the same report argues, were harmed by the impossibility of accessing technologies for the implantation of percutaneous aortic valves, otherwise known as TAVI, which would, through a small surgical procedure, greatly improve the quality of lives and prevent more complex surgeries and longer hospitalizations for Cuban people. American companies such as Edward Life Science, Edward Sapien Valve, and Medtronic Core Valve, weird company names, have control over the TAVI valves, and because of the blockade, prohibit Cuba from accessing it. So in the article, I go through a bunch of these cases, so I'm not going to read them all here, but I encourage you, if you want to know concrete cases of how this works, to look at the articles. And In many instances, additional licenses are required to sell to Cuba, even when companies are not American and don't have and have less than 10% of American capital in them. The Cuban Ministry for Public Health reported that shortages were caused in blood bags because the usual supplier, a company named Unfamed, reported that the company, its larger company, Terumo BCT, that's from Japan, had its bank account blocked because they didn't have the additional license that would allow them to sell to Cuba products that are not produced in the United States. So, I mean, talk about a free market. These conditions were, of course, intensified during the COVID pandemic because the U.S. was, as I once called it, it was trying to exploit the pandemic to increase pressure for regime change. And that means that Cuba was hit with the dual pandemic of COVID and the return of the blockade, which, completely destroyed the island. But there was cases, for instance, of Jack Ma, of course, the owner of Alibaba, who tried to send Cuba hundreds of thousands of face masks, COVID diagnostics kits, ventilators, and gloves. And all of this stuff was blocked in a Colombian airline whose major shareholder was a US based company that's subject to the trade embargo on Cuba. Similarly, there was donations from Swiss solidarity organizations, MediCuba Suiza and Association Suiza Cuba, both of whom we've collaborated before. They've reshared our articles and stuff. They sent donations to fight against COVID, and they were refused to be transferred by Swiss banks UBS, Cler, and Cantonal Bank of Basilea because of course, the US blockade. So similar instances can be seen in a bunch of areas. Like you can write a whole book uh, as to the areas in which the blockade has affected Cuba from acquiring things that it needs to treat its people's medical needs. And I think it's important to also note that, the blockade is not this like static entity that's just there. If it was, it would be extremely easy for the Cuban government to figure out how to move around it. The blockade is a dynamic entity that, as Cuba and the Cuban government reacts to it and finds ways around it, it adjusts itself in order to counteract that reaction from the government. So it's an entity that is in constant motion trying to block in any way possible anything that can potentially help Cuba and prevent it from being in the conditions of poverty that the blockade regime forces Cuba and Cubans into. And really, it hasn't worked. Its aim, of course, was to get Cubans to overthrow the government, and it's been in place for 6 decades. There's been billions of dollars given to Cuban opposition groups, and all that they were able to produce in the largest protest that has ever taken place in Cuba was a few hundred cats on July 11th, 2021, who all had to disperse themselves within minutes when Diaz-Canel told revolutionaries to hit the streets. So it hasn't worked. It has not worked. The Cuban people are with their revolution. They're down for the construction of socialism. They have on their chest the slogan of their bronze titan, Antonio Maceo, who has this famous quote that says that whoever tries to take over Cuba will only collect the dust of their blood-soaked soil if they do not perish in the fight. It's not going to work. So why is it still in place? All it's producing is unnecessary suffering for the Cuban people who are committed to sustaining their sovereignty and their project of constructing socialism.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
that's a beautiful summary. As
Yeah.
was the whole article. Thank you for taking the time to do that research and write that. Is very useful, and I don't know, especially when we talk about COVID, like the way the U.S. utilized COVID was just how Naomi Klein talks about in her book Shock Doctrine, which she labels shock therapy. Anytime there's a natural disaster, a disease, or some opportunity, rather than try and help the way that Cuba does, rather than send doctors to assist or send medical supplies to aid these countries suffering, the U.S. uses it as an opportunity to do the opposite. Oh, there's a pandemic going on. Let's ramp up the embargo and use intellectual property laws to prevent them from getting the vaccine. That'll hurt their people more. It's just destructive and murderous, and it stems from capitalism, though, ultimately. And yeah, it just shows that, I mean, the US, or every country has to ration healthcare. Every country has a certain amount of healthcare. Countries like the Scandinavian countries in Europe, they largely ration based on need, who needs the most care. And the government rations it out that way. But a lot of the healthcare companies are still generally for profit. The US rations care by the size of your wallet. The richer you are, the better care you get. And if you're really rich, you have access to a lot of specialists and a lot of good technology. But the vast majority of the country doesn't have access to that. And if they need it, they're going to be put in debt by it. Cuba has a public system that rations care by need, but is also actively increasing doctors, actively building more hospitals, actively investing in healthcare to bring up the amount of healthcare that they have so they don't even have to ration it as much. So when people talk about wait times or rationing care under socialism, and that's why we can't have it, it is all a bunch of bullshit. It is bullshit coming from someone who's been studying this healthcare system for the past 2 years. They are lying to you. The only way to have a system that rations our care in a rational way is to move to socialism. And that's the only way to increase the amount of care that we have, so there's less rationing that has to go on in general.
All of us in America, in the US, who need health care and can't afford it, who spend our lives working to make somebody else rich, who want to stand against the ruling class taking everything from us and making our families' lives unlivable. It is our duty to stand with those people in Cuba who have the same enemy as us and the same interest as us. This blockade hurting them also hurts us. And so I think it's absolute. What Carlos said was beautiful and poignant, but I just want to add that it is absolutely mandatory for us here to stand with our brothers and sisters there directly in fighting against the blockade.
Absolutely. And it's such a David and Goliath, sort of battle. I mean, and one of the things that we've reiterated is that it's been able to do all of this under immense pressure. I mean, just imagine the success that Cuba could have if it was not under this idiotic blockade that does nothing but make the Cuban people suffer. Someone had mentioned it here pretty well. They said Cuba is color revolution proof, and that's a really good way of putting it. The people are committed with the revolution, and right now they had elections yesterday. Extremely democratic process. It's really the archetype of what democracy could be if the people who say that they believed in democracy actually believed in democracy and acted in accordance with it. But there's some people now stressing out that participation in elections are going down because only like 76% of the people turned out, which it's like 20 and 30 points higher than other countries, other capitalist countries. And the usual in the US was in the mid 50s to low 60s. So it's still like almost 20% higher than in the US. In the US, as of recent, it's been a little bit higher because of the Trump derangement syndrome. But it's hard to get people involved into a political process when they know that process itself is so extremely restrained because of the blockade. They know that the government, regardless of how hard it tries, it's really, it's a monster. It's a monster. It's a dynamic monster. And, just surviving is itself, praiseworthy. But the fact that it thrives in many areas is just completely insane. But, I don't know if I don't think the Cuban people are losing their satisfaction with the revolution. But I do think that it's hard to continue struggling with conditions which are made objectively difficult by the U.S. empire. And we have a president that he said that he was going to go back. That he was going to go back to the Obama era policies with Cuba. We haven't seen that, but I don't see the Cuban people ever really reverting back to how things were before. Their consciousness is way too high, but it is it is this trend. It's not that it's scary, this trend that's gone down in political participation, but it was one of the biggest things to brag about, that in the last constitution that was made, that before this adjustment, the last one, it was 90 something percent people participated. It was 90 something percent voted in favor of, and that was something to genuinely brag about. And that drop to the high 70s is not worrisome, but I think it's telling of a growing absenteeism, not yet substantial in character, which I think is a result of the fact that it's very difficult to change things radically insofar as Cuba is still handcuffed by this criminal blockade. So it's up to all of us to fight to get this blockade removed, to have Biden fulfill the promise that he laid out when he was running his campaign, and really to defend an island that, when socialism collapsed in the East, when it was overthrown, where there was a counter-revolution, I think all of those words are accurate in their own way to describe what happened. Cuba was that lighting fort. Cuba and the DPRK were that fort that told us history's not over. History's not over. We can have a world beyond this hellhole that we're all living in neoliberal capitalism. So we have a duty to defend it, because Cuba was the place that defended by just surviving the hopes of a new world. And now it's our time to really fight like hell to overthrow this stupid and murderous blockade and let Cuba flourish, let Cuba live.
Absolutely. I think that's a good place to sum it up, honestly. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you, Carlos, for sharing your paper with us and doing all that research. Thanks, Noah, for being here. Of course, as always, really appreciate you coming in after work to join us for a stream, and all our moderators as well. Make sure you check out Carlos's new book, The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism, which I'm pulling up now. Very excited about that. I also got the Journal of American Socialist Studies here on our books page, our most recent projects. We are also going to release this on the Patreon. I had said last stream that we're going to do it this week, but we decided to push that back a couple extra weeks. So, in about 2-3 weeks, you can sign up for the Patreon or sign up as a YouTube member, and you'll get an ebook here. Sorry to anybody who expected that to come this week.
Let me
go ahead, Neil. That's all I got to say.
I've gotten a couple questions about the format of the ebook. Is that a PDF or is it a different type of file? Is it a .ebook format? What is it?
I think it's a PDF.
Is it?
Yeah. Okay. It's a PDF, and people have the option of either buying it through Kindle, which is its own type of online reading of sorts, which adjusts itself nicely to iPads and phones, I think phones or Kindle tablets. So they could buy an electronic version either through Kindle or through ebook version for $10, and then the physical version is just $15, and I think maybe like $2 for shipping, $2-3 for shipping. Another thing that we wanted to mention, we've had people ask whether we're going to do an interview with me of sorts talking about the book. I mean, we did one kind of yesterday, very over the top, but something more in depth. And we are planning for either the 3rd or the 4th week of April having a book launch in which various people will talk about the book. Noah and Eddie and Tom will be talking from our institute, but also since it's going to be an event that's co-hosted by the Critical Theory Workshop, we'll have Gabriel Rockhill speaking there as well. It's also co-hosted by the International Manifesto Group, so we'll probably have Radhika Desai and maybe Alan Freeman speaking as well. And then we're hoping to get the other people who endorse the book to give a few words as well on the book. And then obviously I will say a few words. So we're planning on one big event endorsed by like-minded groups who we're in frequent contact with and who we're in collaboration with, who will come say a few words about why they see the book as important in our age. And then so that's going to be our book launch. So look out for that towards the end of April, and I'm really looking forward to it. And I mentioned yesterday that I couldn't be any happier with the responses to the book. So go check it out.
Yo, looking forward to that. I got to get out of here, folks. The sun is slowly creeping towards my eyes, and I've been sick of it for the last 20 minutes. I usually don't stream at this time of day.
Kind of tilt slowly.
I had no idea the sun was going to come in right on my eyes here. I usually stream either after this or before this. So I'm going to have to get some blinds for the next stream. But thank you, everyone, and solidarity. We'll see you on the next stream.